Nathan Carter stood at attention in the blinding light of the Legion's recruitment hall, his shoulders squared despite the obvious weight of judgment pressing down on him. He had spent his entire journey to the training grounds overhearing hushed conversations about the first human recruit, though none of them were particularly flattering. The word week had been thrown around more times than he could count, and the disapproving stares from the instructors only solidified what everyone in the room already believed: he did not belong. Standing among the other recruits, Nathan felt like a child lost in a crowd of giants. To his left towered a reptilian warrior, nearly twice his height, its muscular form covered in thick, scale-plated armor. Its piercing yellow eyes swept over him with the kind of disdain one would reserve for an insect. To his right, a cybernetically enhanced soldier, its limbs reinforced with gleaming titanium, scoffed at his unaugmented flesh and blood. Every single recruit in the hall was bred for war, engineered through centuries of selective evolution or enhanced by advanced technology. And then there was Nathan, short, wiry, and seemingly fragile. The Legion instructors were no different. The lead officer, a burly Vorten general with deep crimson skin and 4 massive arms, paced back and forth in front of the line, barking orders in a guttural tone. His 2 lower arms remained crossed, while his upper pair pointed to various recruits, evaluating them with a glare that could turn steel into vapor. When his gaze finally settled on Nathan, the room fell silent. "What is this?" The general grunted, his lip curling as he stalked forward, stopping directly in front of the human. "Did the Galactic Legion suddenly start accepting scholars instead of warriors?" The recruits chuckled, the sound low and mocking. Nathan remained motionless, his face unreadable. He had expected this. He knew exactly how they saw him: fragile, slow, unworthy. But he also knew something they didn't. He wasn't here to match them in strength. He was here to outthink them. "Sir, I passed all entrance requirements," Nathan said, his voice steady despite the tension around him. "I earned my place here." The general exhaled sharply, unimpressed. "Then prove it." He turned and gestured toward the combat arena, a circular pit where recruits would spar to demonstrate their fighting capabilities. "You will fight." The laughter from the other recruits died down, replaced by curiosity. Nathan glanced at the pit, then at his potential opponents. It was a test, one designed to humiliate him. If he backed down, he would be labeled a coward. If he stepped in and lost too quickly, he would be a disgrace. Either way, they expected him to fail. He rolled his shoulders, exhaling slowly. "Against who?" The general's grin widened, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You'll fight Colrax." A murmur spread through the recruits. Colrax was the largest of them all, a brute from a high-gravity world where survival meant being stronger than anything else. His species, the Tharkari, were infamous for their raw physical dominance, and Nathan was certain that Colrax alone could lift him with one arm and crush him like an empty canister. The Tharkari warrior stepped forward, a slow, deliberate motion that sent vibrations through the floor. His skin was thick, leathery, a dark green hue with jagged ridges across his arms and shoulders. His fangs gleamed as he grinned down at Nathan. "I will try not to break you too quickly, human," Colrax rumbled. Nathan didn't reply. Instead, he stepped into the pit, his heartbeat steady but not out of fear, out of focus. He analyzed every detail of Colrax's posture, the way his weight shifted, the way his claws flexed ever so slightly before curling into fists. The brute had power, but power meant nothing if it couldn't hit its target. The moment the battle began, Colrax lunged forward, his fist swinging downward in a crushing arc meant to end the fight in a single blow. But Nathan wasn't there. He had already sidestepped, barely evading by a fraction of a second. Dust exploded where the Tharkari's fist connected with the floor, the impact cracking the reinforced ground. Before Colrax could recover, Nathan moved, ducking low and striking at the only place he knew would matter, the nerve cluster beneath the Tharkari's ribs. His fist connected, and for a brief second, Colrax froze. The nerve impact sent a jolt through his massive body, just enough to stagger him. Nathan wasted no time. He pivoted around Colrax's side, avoiding the counterswing, and struck again, this time at the back of the knee. The Tharkari faltered, but he did not fall. "Fast," Colrax admitted, his grin widening rather than disappearing. The second attack came with twice the force. Kolrak swung, faster this time, adjusting for Nathan's speed. But Nathan wasn't fighting strength with strength. He let the strike come, shifting his body at the last possible second so that Kolrak's momentum carried him forward, unbalanced. The moment the Tharkari overextended, Nathan capitalized. He hooked his foot behind Kolrak's ankle and pulled. Kolrak hit the ground. The recruits watching let out an audible gasp. The Tharkari species were built like fortresses, and to see one fall, especially to the weakest-looking recruit, was something none of them had expected. Nathan took a step back, waiting. He had no illusions that Kolrak was finished. True to form, the Tharkari pushed himself up, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then he laughed, a deep, resonating sound that echoed through the training hall. He wiped a speck of dust from his chin and gave Nathan an approving nod. "Not bad, human," he rumbled. "Not bad at all." The general, who had been watching silently, studied Nathan with new eyes. He was still unimpressed, but there was something else in his gaze now, consideration. He gestured for Nathan to step out of the pit. "You are still weak," the general said gruffly. "But you might not be useless." It wasn't a compliment, but it was enough. Nathan had made his first mark in the Legion. He knew the battles ahead would be harder, that many still saw him as fragile, insignificant. But that was fine. He wasn't here to prove his strength. He was here to make them fear him. Nathan adjusted his grip on the rifle, his fingers steady despite the suffocating tension hanging in the air. The outpost was quiet, too quiet. His breath was controlled, measured, but his mind was already calculating every possible scenario that could unfold in the next few moments. The mission had been simple: defend the supply station while the main battalion pushed forward into enemy territory. But simple missions never stayed that way. The sky above the barren world of Othar 7 was a sickly orange, streaked with the swirling dust storms that had made the planet nearly uninhabitable. The supply station, built into the rocky terrain, was little more than a reinforced bunker surrounded by automated turrets and energy shields. It should have been secure. It should have been impenetrable. And yet, the alarms had sounded less than an hour ago, movement detected just beyond the perimeter. Nathan crouched behind a stack of supply crates, his rifle raised, scanning the horizon through the scope. His squad had been spread thin, positioned at various points around the base. Most of the recruits still didn't trust him, didn't acknowledge his presence unless absolutely necessary. That suited him fine. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here to survive. A flicker of movement caught his eye. At first, it was just a shadow against the storm, a blur of shifting darkness. But then it solidified, a massive figure, its body wrapped in the sleek, organic armor of the Zirathi. The enemy had arrived. Nathan had studied them in tactical briefings, 3 meters tall, built for war, their bodies layered with a biological exoskeleton that could deflect most standard projectiles. They were hunters, their movements precise, methodical, as if every step was calculated for maximum efficiency. This one moved with the confidence of a predator certain of its victory. Nathan exhaled slowly and steadied his aim. The Zirathi stopped, its glowing yellow eyes sweeping the base. Then, without warning, it moved. Not toward the main entrance, not toward the turrets, but directly toward Nathan's position. His mind sharpened, instincts flaring to life. It knew he was there. Nathan barely had time to shift before the enemy lunged. The force of impact sent him crashing backward, his rifle knocked from his hands. He rolled with the momentum, absorbing the shock as he hit the ground. The Zirathi loomed over him, its jagged blades glinting under the weak sunlight. Nathan reacted before his mind could catch up. He kicked off the ground, rolling to the side as the first blade struck where he had been a second ago. Dust and metal shards erupted from the impact. His hands scrambled for a weapon, any weapon. His fingers closed around his combat knife. It was a pathetic weapon against an enemy like this. But he didn't need to kill. He just needed to survive. The Zirathi moved fast, faster than something its size should have been capable of. It swung again, a wide arc that would have split him in two if he had been slower.
But speed wasn't the only thing that mattered.
He ducked under the strike, using his small frame to his advantage. The blade skimmed past, missing by inches. His mind worked at a blistering pace.
Standard rounds wouldn't pierce its armor. Blades wouldn't cut deep enough.
But there were always weaknesses.
The Zarathi lunged again, its strike coming from above.
Nathan twisted his body, letting the momentum of his dodge carry him closer, too close for the enemy to use its full strength. His knife found a gap in the armor, right beneath the ribs, where the plating was weakest.
He drove the blade in with all the force he had. The Zarathi snarled, its massive hand swiping at him in retaliation.
The back of its arm caught his shoulder, sending a sharp jolt of pain through his body. He staggered but held on.
He twisted the knife deeper. The enemy roared, its body convulsing, but it wasn't dead. It wasn't even close. Nathan's mind raced.
He needed something bigger, something that could turn the tide before reinforcements arrived. His gaze darted toward the wreckage of the impact, where his rifle had landed. No, not the rifle, the power cell. His fingers worked fast, reaching for the knife on his belt. Not to fight, but to pry open the Zarathis armor. He tore at the plating near the wound, exposing the pulsing, dark blue tissue beneath. The enemy thrashed, trying to throw him off, but Nathan was relentless. His free hand darted for the power cell. It was still intact, its energy core humming with barely contained power.
One shot wouldn't kill the Zarathi. But a concentrated explosion from inside its body? Nathan didn't hesitate.
He slammed the power cell into the open wound and rolled away just as the detonation triggered. The explosion was brief, but violent. The Zarathi's body jerked, its roar cutting off in a strangled gasp as the energy burned through its insides. Its massive frame collapsed, the impact shaking the ground. The glowing yellow eyes dimmed.
Silence.
Nathan pushed himself up, his breath sharp and uneven. His shoulder ached, his uniform was torn, but he was alive. The base's calm channel crackled to life. "Enemy down," someone said, the voice tinged with disbelief.
Nathan didn't respond.
He simply retrieved his rifle, checked the power level, and turned his gaze back to the horizon.
The battle wasn't over. Not yet.
Nathan sat on the edge of a makeshift cot in the dimly lit barracks, wrapping a fresh bandage around his shoulder. The pain from his encounter with the Zarathi lingered, a dull throb reminding him of just how close he had come to death. He had expected to be questioned, perhaps even reprimanded for his reckless tactics, but no such thing happened.
Instead, whispers filled the halls. The human had taken down a Zarathi warrior in single combat. Some called it luck.
Others called it impossible. Either way, the rumors spread like wildfire.
He knew what would come next. The moment an unknown element disrupted the expected hierarchy, it became a target.
His assumptions proved correct the next morning when he was summoned to the war room. The air inside was thick with tension, the atmosphere heavy with the scent of polished steel and artificial ozone from the holographic war table in the center of the chamber.
High-ranking officers stood around it, their gazes shifting toward him the moment he entered.
General Vakros, the Vortin who had first doubted him, observed him with a scrutinizing glare, arms folded across his broad chest. "Carter," the general began, his voice like grinding stone. "Since you seem so eager to prove yourself, your next assignment will be a live field operation.
No simulations. No safety nets." He tapped the table, and a three-dimensional map flickered to life. "Our scouts intercepted communications indicating an enemy outpost in Sector 8 Gamma.
Small, but fortified. You will be part of the strike team sent to eliminate it." Nathan kept his expression neutral, though he could feel the weight of every eye in the room pressing down on him.
He wasn't being given an opportunity.
He was being tested. "Understood," he said evenly.
Vakros narrowed his eyes. "Do not mistake this for recognition, human. You will follow orders. No improvisation. No heroics."
Nathan simply nodded, but deep down, he knew the reality of war rarely followed orders. The dropship vibrated with the low hum of its thrusters as it sliced through the upper atmosphere, descending toward the planet below. The strike team was composed of seasoned warriors, each one more experienced than the last. Nathan remained silent, listening to their banter, the quiet exchange of last-minute checks and shared confidence.
None of them spoke to him. He preferred it that way. The outpost loomed in the distance as they approached, a cluster of metallic structures nestled between jagged cliffs.
The terrain was treacherous, with narrow paths and unstable rock formations, a natural fortress. The mission was supposed to be straightforward: infiltrate, disable defenses, and neutralize any remaining hostiles. But Nathan had learned quickly that nothing was ever as simple as it seemed. The moment the dropship touched down, the team moved with practiced efficiency.
Nathan kept to the rear, rifle in hand, scanning the surroundings for any sign of movement.
The approach was eerily quiet.
No patrols. No visible resistance. Something was wrong.
As the lead scout advanced, his foot triggered a barely visible tripwire. The explosion was instant. The shockwave sent Nathan sprawling backward, his ears ringing as shrapnel tore through the air. The strike team's tight formation collapsed as the ambush began.
From the cliffs above, enemy snipers emerged, firing down on them with precise, lethal shots.
The main entrance of the outpost burst open, releasing a squad of Zerathi warriors, their organic armor gleaming under the pale light of the sky.
Chaos erupted.
Nathan rolled behind a large rock, his mind racing. The strike team was pinned down, caught between the high ground snipers and the advancing ground troops. Their cover was limited, and the enemy had planned the ambush perfectly.
He could see the panic setting in.
One of the Vorten soldiers was already down, a clean shot through his helmet. Another had taken a direct hit to the shoulder, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The Zerathi were advancing with brutal efficiency, closing the distance rapidly.
Nathan's instincts took over. He scanned the battlefield, mapping out every detail in seconds.
The enemy snipers were positioned along the ridgeline, but they were focused on the center of the battlefield, on the main force. They hadn't accounted for someone moving outside their predicted pattern. He made his decision. Moving low, he sprinted toward the far side of the battlefield, using the scattered debris as cover. His movements were calculated, unpredictable.
The snipers didn't notice him at first, too occupied with the larger targets. By the time they did, it was too late.
He reached the base of the cliff and scaled the jagged rock face, ignoring the burning strain in his muscles. The first sniper never saw him coming. Nathan grabbed the alien's elongated rifle and drove the butt of it into the back of its skull, the impact sending the enemy tumbling down the cliff. The second sniper turned too late. Nathan fired, the energy round striking true.
The tide of battle shifted.
With the snipers eliminated, the strike team regained its footing. The remaining Zerathi were now exposed, forced into direct combat without their high ground advantage. Nathan rejoined the fight, his rifle firing with precise, calculated bursts. Within minutes, the battlefield was theirs.
The aftermath was grim.
3 members of the team were dead, and another was badly wounded. Nathan stood among the wreckage, his uniform streaked with dust and blood, his hands still gripping his rifle.
The remaining soldiers looked at him differently now. Not with disdain. Not with mockery. But with something else. Recognition.
As the dropship arrived to extract them, one of the surviving officers, an old, grizzled veteran with a scar running down the side of his face, stepped up to him. He studied Nathan for a long moment before nodding. "Damn good work, kid." Nathan didn't respond. He just slung his rifle over his shoulder and boarded the ship.
The legend had begun.
Nathan stood in the center of the war camp, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. Around him, warriors from every corner of the Galactic Legion had gathered, forming a massive circle. The air crackled with anticipation, the weight of what was about to happen settling heavily over the camp. Across from him stood General Kathun, the undefeated warlord of the Zerathi, his towering frame rigid with controlled fury. The challenge had been issued the moment the High Command received reports of Nathan's victories. The Zarathi refused to believe a human, a species considered weak by galactic standards, had outmaneuvered their forces. They saw it as an insult to their honor, a blemish on their reputation as the deadliest warriors in the known systems. And so, Kathan had come, not as a soldier but as an executioner. Nathan knew this was more than a duel. It was a message. The terms were clear: single combat, no weapons, no interference. A fight to the death. If he lost, humanity's rising reputation in the Legion would be shattered. If he won, the Zarathi would have no choice but to acknowledge what they had refused to accept. Kathan moved first. The Zarathi lunged, the ground trembling beneath his massive weight. His strike was devastating, fast, powerful, lethal. But Nathan had fought beings larger than him before. He saw the slight shift in Kathan's stance, the momentary tightening of his shoulder just before the attack. He moved before the blow could land, twisting his body just enough to let the strike sail past him. The wind from the missed punch rushed against his skin, the force alone enough to kill a lesser man. But he was already reacting, already shifting his weight, already countering. He struck at the Zarathi's exposed ribs, driving his fist into the nerve cluster beneath the armor plating. It was the same weak point he had exploited before, but this time, it didn't have the same effect. Kathan barely flinched. Nathan ducked as the warlord's knee shot upward, narrowly avoiding having his ribs shattered. He rolled to the side, keeping himself moving, never staying still long enough to become an easy target. The gathered warriors roared with excitement, the fight unlike anything they had expected. This was supposed to be a one-sided execution. But Nathan was still standing. Kathan pivoted, his movements deceptively quick for his size. He anticipated Nathan's next move, cutting off his escape route with a sudden backhanded strike. Nathan barely managed to raise his arms in time to absorb the impact, but the sheer force sent him skidding backward. His arms throbbed from the blow, but he ignored the pain. Pain was irrelevant. Kathan pressed forward, relentless. Nathan had seen it before, the overconfidence of warriors who had never truly been challenged. They fought with power, with dominance, with the absolute certainty that they could not be beaten. But that was also their weakness. Kathan swung again, a brutal downward strike meant to crush Nathan's skull. But Nathan had studied the way the Zarathi moved, the split-second openings in their attacks. He sidestepped, just out of reach, and then he struck, not with strength, but with precision. His fingers found the warlord's throat, pressing into a pressure point just beneath the hardened ridges of his jaw. It wasn't enough to disable him, but it was enough to disrupt his balance. Kathan staggered. The crowd fell silent. Nathan saw the warlord's fury ignite, saw the moment his pride turned into something far more dangerous. Kathan's movements became wilder, his attacks fueled by rage rather than calculation. Nathan let him burn through it, let him waste energy on attacks that never quite landed. Then, he found his opening. Kathan overextended, just slightly, just enough. Nathan moved like a shadow, stepping inside the warlord's guard. He used Kathan's own momentum against him, shifting his weight and driving his knee upward. The impact connected beneath the Zarathi's sternum, right at the center of his secondary heart. Kathan choked. The warlord dropped to one knee, his massive frame trembling. Nathan didn't wait. He struck again, this time driving his elbow into the side of Kathan's skull. The warlord collapsed. Silence engulfed the camp. Nathan stood over his fallen opponent, his breath steady, his body aching but unbroken. Then, the first sound came: a single, heavy thud. One of the Zarathi warriors pounded his fist against his chest in salute. Then another. And another. The entire Zarathi contingent, the very same warriors who had called him weak, now honored him in the only way they knew how. Nathan had not just won. He had conquered their respect. Nathan walked through the war camp, his movements calm and measured, though he could feel the weight of every eye on him. Soldiers who once dismissed him now watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. The duel had changed everything. Word of his victory over General Kathan had spread beyond the battlefield, echoing across every faction in the Galactic Legion. The Zarathi, once his greatest skeptics, had been the first to acknowledge him, not as an anomaly, not as a fluke, but as a warrior worthy of their respect. The Legion High Command had no choice but to recognize what had become undeniable. Nathan Carter was no longer an unknown recruit, no longer a human struggling to prove himself among giants. He had become something else entirely. A force to be reckoned with. His presence at the war councils was no longer a formality. His strategies were no longer ignored. Commanders who once dismissed him as weak now studied his tactics, eager to understand how he thought, how he fought. His victories were no longer seen as luck but as calculated, deliberate, the result of a mind that saw war differently than anyone else. But with recognition came consequence. Nathan had not just earned the respect of his allies, he had drawn the full attention of his enemies. The Zarathi High Command, humiliated by Khathun's defeat, had placed a bounty on his head. Assassins, mercenaries, and rival factions saw him as both a challenge and a prize. The more victories he accumulated, the more stories spread, and with them, the fear. They whispered his name in war rooms. They studied his battles, searching for weaknesses. They feared him. And that fear gave him power. Nathan understood this better than anyone. He had never relied on brute strength, never fought battles on the enemy's terms. Fear was a weapon just like any other. He wielded it carefully, knowing it could win wars before they even began. The moment that solidified his legend came 6 months after the duel. A planetary siege on Darak 4, a heavily fortified enemy stronghold, had dragged into a brutal, unwinnable stalemate. The Galactic Legion had lost thousands in failed assaults, unable to breach the city's defenses. Conventional strategies had failed. The enemy was prepared for every possible attack except for the one Nathan devised. He proposed something unthinkable. The Legion wouldn't attack. They would let the enemy destroy itself. It began with psychological warfare. Carefully planted misinformation suggested an internal coup among the enemy's leadership. Sabotage teams disrupted their food and water supply. Communications were intercepted, edited, and fed back into their network, creating paranoia and mistrust. Then the final blow, Nathan personally led a small infiltration unit into the heart of the stronghold, not to fight, but to be seen. He let them glimpse him, just enough to confirm their worst fears. The moment they realized the human they had been ordered to kill was inside their own walls, the panic spread like wildfire. Leaders turned on each other. Soldiers abandoned their posts. When the Legion finally advanced, the enemy had already collapsed from within. Darak 4 fell without a single large-scale battle. That was the moment the galaxy truly understood what Nathan Carter had become. The war ended a year later. Not because one side had annihilated the other, but because no one dared to fight anymore. When Nathan's name was attached to a campaign, enemies surrendered before the first shot was fired. The Zarathi, once humanity's fiercest rivals, brokered a peace treaty not out of diplomacy, but out of survival. His legend continued to grow, but Nathan himself remained the same. He had never sought power, never fought for glory. He had only ever fought to survive. But in doing so, he had changed the balance of the galaxy forever. And so, when the final War Council convened, when the galaxy stood on the precipice of a new era, Nathan did what no one expected. He walked away. He left behind the battlefields, the war rooms, the fear that followed his name. He disappeared into the void, leaving behind only rumors and unanswered questions. Some said he had retired to a distant colony, living in solitude. Others believed he was still out there, watching, waiting. But one thing was certain. Nathan Carter was no longer the weakest recruit. He was the most feared warrior the galaxy had ever known.